Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichek, and today we're going to talk about natural selection. Start off with some quick definitions. So you've got evolution. Evolution is just a change in a population over time. It's important to note that we're talking about a population, not an individual. So evolution looks at populations and shifts in those populations over a period of time. Individuals cannot evolve. If you want to look at it from a genetic perspective, it's a change in the allele frequency of a population over a period of time. So that population or gene pool, you have a shift in the percentage of alleles in that population. Now those shifts, those changes can happen in lots of different ways. Natural selection is just one mechanism by which a population can change over time. So that's just what we're going to focus on today, but there's other ways that populations can change, like genetic drift or gene flow or mutation. Those can all affect a population, but we're just going to focus on natural selection for today. And the big idea here is that there's some factor or factors in an environment that are going to select or choose the individuals that are best suited. They get to survive and they get to reproduce. And over time, you see a shift in the population. So the basics of Darwin's ideas are that you have heritable variation. So there's a variation in the population, and it has to be inheritable. It's not something that you acquire during your lifetime. You have overproduction of offspring. Basically, you have more offspring than the environment could support. So if all of the offspring survived to adulthood and had offspring of their own, they would use up all the resources in the environment. Because of that, you have competition between them for resources like food or mates, getting away from predators. There's differential survival. Not everybody survives. Those that do survive, we say, have an adaptation, something that they inherited that allows them to outcompete their siblings. And you have differential reproduction. So if you survive, then you get to reproduce, and you leave behind more of those adaptations, and so they become more common in a population. So it takes a little closer look at that whole idea. So let's say this is your environment. You have these light-colored trees, and this is you. You are a light-colored moth. Now, you're very well adapted to your environment, and you leave behind lots of offspring. So here, you can see, if you look really closely at that picture, those are actually moth eggs. So organisms do tend to leave more offspring than the environment could support. Because of this, there's some competition to survive. There's a finite supply of environmental resources, and so there's this struggle for existence, as Darwin put it. And that could be food, shelter, finding a mate, avoiding predators. It could also be things like sunlight, water, oxygen. If you're an aquatic organism, oxygen is going to be really important. For plants, sunlight is a factor. So all of these are going to be are going to influence who survives and who doesn't. Another factor that comes into play is this inherited variation. So you have different individuals being born into a population with different variations. And these phenotypes or variations are the result of different gene combinations. You can have these differences because of mutation, crossing over, independent assortment. That variation originally comes from a mutation. So all variation originally was a mutation. Some random change in the DNA. Sexual reproduction also contributes highly to variation. So meiosis, this mixing of alleles, genetic recombination. And so you have lots of offspring with lots of different combinations of alleles and traits. Those new combinations give you new phenotypes, and those phenotypes are what make natural selection possible. If everyone was a clone and the environment changed, you could wipe out the entire population. All right, so not every variation is going to be good. Now, originally, if the trees were all light colored and you were born with light coloring as a moth, you were doing great. But if the trees all of a sudden started getting really dark, what used to be an adaptation is now a liability. So as the environment changes, different phenotypes are going to be more successful. An adaptation is any variation that helps one survive in its environment. That variation itself is random. You don't get to choose what adaptation you're going to have. Once you're born, you either have an adaptation or you don't. And an advantage in one environment could be a disadvantage in another. So here again, you can see the dark-colored moth blends very well with its environment. So if the environment shifts, adaptations, something that was an adaptation in one environment may not be so good in another. You need to remember that you can't evolve or change to suit your environment. Whether you are adapted happens beforehand. So then you get this differential reproductive success. So those individuals who survive get to reproduce. And if you get to reproduce, you can pass on those traits to your offspring. So that's this whole survival of the fittest. It's important to note that this isn't survival of the strongest. It's just survival of the one who, survival of the fittest is really the one who leaves behind the most offspring. Over time, those traits are going to accumulate in the environment, and the population as a whole will become better suited to the environment. And that's pretty much it. That's natural selection. The example we were using with the moths with the light and dark colors was something called industrial melanism, and they actually saw this in action with the Industrial Revolution. You had an increase in air pollution, and it started to change the color of the trees. And so where you usually had light-colored moths, you ended up having these much darker colored moths, the allele for darker color increasing in the population over a relatively short period of time, because that coloring the light coloring was no longer advantageous to those organisms. Interestingly, now if you look at the moths, the coloring has shifted back as the trees and the environment shifted. This idea of descent with modification, so sometimes you'll hear natural selection or evolution talked about as descent with modification. The idea behind that is that each living species has descended with changes from other species over time. Offspring are slightly different from their parents, and that those changes accumulated over a period of time. So what I'd like you to do, you can't see that, there we go, is explain evolution of a species by natural selection in response to an environmental change. So basically see if you can answer this question and try to make sure that you have 7 marks in your answer. And then we'll go over that when you get to class. All right, thanks. Bye.